New Orleans true crime from the deep, unsolved, the ghosts of the two sisters. New Orleans is sometimes considered the murder capital of the United States. Well-known tales like Lalauries' torture, the Axeman who loved jazz, or the Sultan and his harem are woven into the mystique of the city, and the ghosts from these stories that wander between realms are prized sights for many tourists. Today, I want to dig up a lesser known true crime case from New Orleans, a case that is still unsolved and unfortunately still has relevant lessons. I share the story of Diddie Cooper with you in the hopes that looking back makes it a little easier to understand more deeply why domestic abuse is so often unreported and how even a prominent woman still lacks justice more than 70 years later. We start in the French Quarter in 1832. 38 years after the second fire, the first address was 139 Royal, but now we know it as 613 Royal Street. It was originally built for a New Orleans financier. It remained a family home for a while and then became apartments with a store beneath. The store transitioned between a cafe and a dentist and a stationer and the home of the French vice consul before becoming a shop called the Two Sisters. The Two Sisters catered to Creole high society, by all accounts. Named for the sisters who ran the fancy goods establishment, it provided the necessary details for Mardi Gras balls for young ladies, like ribbons and lace. The shop is listed in the New Orleans City Directory between 1886 and 1906. Legend holds that the sisters would share their spectacular courtyard with their favorite patrons. The courtyard at 613 Royal is said to be the largest and most beautiful courtyard in the French Quarter. Family drama, or maybe changing demographics, or possibly just retirement, drove the sisters out of their French Quarter shop, but they lived for nearly 4 more decades. In 1944, they died within 2 months of each other, outliving all of their family, and a neighbor made sure they were buried in their family tomb in St. Louis Cemetery, number 3. 20 years after the Shop of the Two Sisters closed, and nearly 100 years after the 3-story structure was built in 1926, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition, although, to be honest, it was never really formally welcomed in New Orleans, a city built only on swamp and formalities. The sisters were nestled in their retirement retreat away from the French Quarter. At 613 Royal Street, Anthony Dinopoulos was in a fight with the Vieux Carré Commission to turn the old store into a cabaret. His French Quarter neighbors, not unlike the NIMBYs of today, fought to remain free from cabarets in their backyards, especially in a prized courtyard like the one at 613 Royal Street. Also, like today, the residents lost the battle and the legends of the restaurant began. We find it first listed in the restaurant section of the directory in 1927, 1 year later. It was a restaurant called Rue Royale Rendezvous and Le Café Royal before it finally succumbed to the Court of Two Sisters moniker in 1935, less than a decade after Dinopoulos and the Vieux Carré Commission went head-to-head. And 1 year after that, in 1936, it was already the famous restaurant of the Courtyard of the Two Sisters. In the 1938 New Orleans City Guide, the restaurant is described: Court of the Two Sisters, 613 Royal, standing here on the site of the former residence of the Governor Perrier, ruler of the French colony in the early part of the 18th century. It is an old building whose spacious courtyard is one of the largest and best known in New Orleans. The earlier building was also, according to one tradition, occupied by Governor Vaudreuil, the Great Marquis, whose regime in New Orleans patterned its social life after the court of Versailles under the Marquis de Pompadour. The present 3-story brick edifice was built in 1832, but did not receive its popular name until more than 50 years later, when it was occupied by two sisters, Emma and Bertha Camours, who, for 20 years, carried on a fancy and variety store here. The ground floor of the building is now decorated so as to give one the impression of being a sidewalk cafe. Just 1 year before the City Guide was published, in 1937, the restaurant was bought by Jimmy Cooper. Jimmy was a 27-year-old Mississippian who took a detour through Chicago before landing in New Orleans. In less than 20 years, he would be dead. But first, he was the subject of at least 2 murder investigations. He had a knack for marketing, and the port city identity of the Crescent City, combined with the tendencies of sailors, let Jimmy rein them in and create an environment that quickly became known around the country for its recipes, charming courtyard, and sights to be seen. At this time, economic recovery from the Great Depression was still at the forefront of minds. Thomas Williams came down the Mississippi hoping to write for the Federal Writers Project of the Works Progress Administration. Luckily, he became Tennessee Williams instead. New Orleans at this time was the New Orleans he wrote about, swarming with the bohemian artists that revitalized the French Quarter more than that Vieux Carré Commission ever could, memorializing it in the art that still captivates us more than 80 years later. 500,000 people called New Orleans home, almost double today's population, along with the world's largest shipside cotton warehouse and the largest coffee and banana terminals. It was an important city economically, as it remains today, and travelers from around the world passed through New Orleans for business and pleasure. Many of them visited Jimmy at the Court of Two Sisters for a memorable Creole meal in the most beautiful courtyard in the French Quarter. Before we go further, a note about my sources. These are the write-ups about the story that I found online. They are all wonderful, but very condensed compared to the amount recorded about this story, so some important details are often missing. I accessed an article called Who Did Diddie In on academia.edu, but I have received several sketchy emails since I signed up for that site. I mostly relied on our newspaper archives, accessed through the New Orleans Public Library, to piece together forgotten details. The story was covered extensively, locally and nationally. I have included images of the original articles where possible. I read the coverage from each day of the trial, along with coverage from after the murder and the indictment. My main conclusion from looking at the original sources is that this victim's story has gotten warped to leave her almost at gold digger status. But the truth is much more complex than a society girl looking for rich husbands. Diddie was a talented singer and a driven woman who was trying to navigate a world of misogyny. We would likely know her for her singing or songwriting instead of her murder if things had gone differently. But unfortunately, her story resonates through time because of its likelihood, even today. But back to Jimmy at the Court of Two Sisters for now. Jimmy was a talented marketer who seems to have produced many of the legends surrounding the restaurant that still exist. He made postcards which you can find examples of both blank and sent around the internet, advertising these legends, many with a note that Diddie Cooper was the owner. Jimmy was a character with a backstory. He was from Mississippi, one of 6 children, and he studied medicine for 3 years in Chicago. He got wrapped up in a scheme to sell stolen cars and spent 6 months in jail in Cook County. He first managed theaters in New Orleans before he bought the Court of Two Sisters. Then Jimmy served in the military around the world and returned with the scars of experience. He worked the mess halls in the Army, and he was gone for more than 3 years during World War II. He finished as a captain, having served in China, Burma, India, the Middle East, and Panama. In March of 1945, the Times-Picayune published an article which revealed Jimmy as the head cook at the Tehran Conference in 1943, where Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt met to strategize. It was a pivotal moment in the war, as it was the first meeting of the Big Three Allied forces, and specifically, the first time Roosevelt and Stalin met. While he was gone, his first wife, Mildred, who went by Millie and was a beauty queen when she was young, ran the restaurant. Perhaps it was Millie who had a knack for advertising. Regardless, Jimmy certainly could mingle with visitors from around the world thanks to his worldly experience in the military. In 1951, Jimmy divorced his first wife after a 2-year separation. The divorce documents detail a marriage rife with cruelty and abuse. He immediately married a beautiful young television singer and actress, Amelie Diddie Woolfolk Trellis Cooper. Diddie was a socialite and a local TV personality in the mid-20th century. Born in 1921, she had grown up in a prominent family in the Fontainebleau neighborhood in uptown New Orleans. Her name appears readily in the newspaper society pages throughout her childhood and young adult years. While Diddie was born too late to shop with the two sisters, she was exactly the type of young lady that the sisters catered to in their charming French Quarter courtyard that eventually became Jimmy's Restaurant. Diddie attended Newcomb College at Tulane University. She was described as a fun-loving Newcomb student who was known around the campus for her singing enthusiasm by the New Orleans Item on December 1st, 1952. In fact, when she was 17 years old in 1938, she was chosen for the show Gateway to Hollywood, an early predecessor to American Idol, for a chance to win a spot on an RKO picture. RKO is the same production company that made King Kong in 1933 and Citizen Kane in 1941. In 1940, Diddie joined Hal Kemp's orchestra as a featured singer in Memphis and was supposed to perform with him in San Francisco. She was the first New Orleans society girl to be hired by a big-time band. Diddie was driven, Diddie was talented, and Diddie had opportunities. She was formally presented as a debutante on December 2nd, 1941. Mysteriously, the location was undisclosed in the society pages, but was one of the smart Rue Carré centers. Her presentation included pale yellow roses in the decor. Her gown had puffed sleeves and a ruffled white silk skirt, and a bodice of silver lame with a sweetheart neck. The write-up of the ancient tradition of trying to sell your daughter ends with a quip. There were numbers of callers during the tea hours of 4 and 6 o'clock. As a society girl, Diddie would likely have had no choice in participating in this tradition, even though it seems like quite a departure from the talented and determined girl who wanted to be a singer. Less than a year after her debut, in September 1942, she met and married Macrino Mackey Trellis II, who was an heir to the M. Trellis Cigar Factory. His father, Macrino Sr., started the company in 1914. He was also a cadet in the U.S. Air Corps. On September 13, 1942, the Times-Picayune recorded, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Moore Woolfolk have announced the marriage of their only daughter, Miss Amelie Jane Woolfolk, to Mr. Macrino Raoul Trellis, son of Mr. and Mrs. Macrino Trellis of this city, which was quietly celebrated Saturday evening, September 5th, in Alabama, where Mr. Trellis is on active duty with the United States Army. The ceremony was performed in the chapel of the Army base by Chaplain Jane Perigo, with only the immediate family members of the two families and a few of the bridegroom's classmates attending. News of the marriage was of much interest here as no previous announcement had been made. Going to Alabama for the wedding were the bride's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Woolfolk, and Mr. and Mrs. Trellis, parents of the bridegroom. Mackey was born in 1916, making him 26 years old in 1942. Diddie was 21. From Alabama, the couple moved to Florida, where Mackey was stationed in September 1942, then to Columbus, Mississippi, then to Texas in March of 1943, on to Nebraska in June, and to North Carolina in November. Macrino III was born October 24, 1943. In 1944, the same year the famous sisters died, Mackey was deployed to Europe and fought in World War II. He sent his presidential citation home for his son's first birthday that October. Mackey returned from war the following October in 1945 as a lieutenant in the United States Air Corps on terminal leave. His family lived in the Gentilly neighborhood, which was being newly developed at the time, on Desai Boulevard. Mackey had inherited money from his father, but it ran out quickly. Mackey did not have a career or any interest in one by Diddie's parents' accounts. Diddie and Mackey separated and divorced 6 years into their marriage, about 1948. She received a separation allowance to take care of their 2 children. We were in love. I loved her, but she didn't love me, Mackey said of Diddie. But Diddie did love him at one point. A colleague who also knew her during school was quoted in the New Orleans Item in 1952. I remember her courtship way back in 1941 or 1942 with her first husband. She was crazy about him. I wish that could have worked out. I remember when she went to a couple of parties, Mackey Macrino Trellis didn't happen to be there. How that girl moped. Which may offer some explanation of the quick and surprising unannounced wedding before he shipped off for war. After her first marriage ended, Diddie returned to pursuing her singing career. She was a featured singer on her own TV show on WDSU in 1950. Date with Diddie was described in the paper, starring Diddie Trellis and guests. It is a delightful stanza of music and songs. The show lasted for more than a year. The WDSU station was in the French Quarter at this time, at 520 Royal Street. During her time on the show, she would sometimes get coffee or dinner at the Court of Two Sisters, 1 block away, according to her mother. On one of these occasions, Diddie Cooper was introduced to her. I don't know who introduced them, but immediately he was bowled over by her good looks, Mrs. Woolfolk said. In today's terms, Jimmy fully love-bombed Diddie. Diddie's family tried to warn her by sharing his divorce documents with her, but she said it was lies and that Jimmy had only shown her love. Diddie's mother recalled, "Now he is the type of man who sweeps a girl off her feet, a very ardent suitor, flowers, attention, telephone calls, presents, good manners, sweet words, his big Cadillac. He also had a boat at the time, and he must have seemed to Diddie to be the answer to her prayers." In 1949, Jimmy was formally separated from his first wife. By this point, Diddie Cooper was well known in New Orleans as the owner of the Court of Two Sisters for more than a decade. Jimmy claimed to be friends with Diddie and Mackie while they were married. "She and Mac Trellis and I were friends," Jimmy was quoted in a December 1st, 1952 New Orleans Item article. In 1950, about the same time she had her TV show, Diddie wrote a song called "Why Did I Believe You?" and took steps to publish it with the Library of Congress for copyright, but it was listed as unpublished that year among more than 19,000 other unpublished songs. I searched for sheet music, but I couldn't find any. If anyone knows how to find the music for unpublished songs, I would love to know more about this song. I wonder, was it autobiographical? Was she speaking to her first husband, Mackie? Could she be referring to the missed opportunities with her career? Her new beau, Jimmy? It was listed right next to another unpublished song by the exact same name that year, so maybe it was just a popular song subject? Around this time during her TV days, Jimmy and Diddie became a couple. They married on June 30th, 1951. Jimmy's divorce from his first wife was finalized days prior, on June 15th, 1951. Date with Diddie ended when she became pregnant with Jimmy's son Donald, who was born in 1952. Jimmy and Diddie first lived in the apartment over the Court of Two Sisters restaurant, but eventually they moved in with Diddie's children and her grandmother uptown on Louisiana Avenue Parkway, near her childhood home. In June 1952, Diddie and Jimmy were formally separated less than a year into their marriage. After their separation, Diddie remained uptown, while Jimmy spent his nights at the apartment in the French Quarter at 613 Royal Street. We'll leave Diddie and Jimmy in the summer of 1952, splitting time between uptown and downtown, for now. Make sure to like the video so Diddie can have a little more spotlight of the famous New Orleans cases. Sharing Diddie's story is one way we can make sure that domestic violence is not hidden in families and that victims can seek justice. Subscribe to be sure to catch part 2 and the rest of Diddie's story, coming soon.